The emergency lights cast a blood-red glow across orbital research station Prometheus, their rhythmic pulsing a death knell for humanity's most advanced deep space research facility. Captain Aria Chen gripped the quantum reactive handle of her last resort weapon, watching as the alien boarding party moved with predatory precision through the station's decimated corridors. They were crystalline hunters from the Vornak Collective, beings of living crystal and impossible geometry, whose bodies shifted and refracted light like multifaceted nightmares. Each movement was a calculated dance of destruction, their razor-sharp appendages slicing through reinforced bulkheads as if they were paper. Status report. Aria whispered into her neural comm, knowing full well she was the only human left alive on this section of the station. The response came not in words, but in a cascading data stream that exploded across her retinal implants. The station's AI, ARIS-7, Adaptive Resonance Intelligence Algorithm, was dying, but not without a fight. 67 research team members, all terminated in less than 3 minutes. The Vornak didn't just kill, they consumed. Each fallen human was rapidly being broken down, their neural patterns and cellular structures analyzed, dissected, understood. It was a process of total information extraction that left nothing but dust and fragmented memories. Aria Chen was different. She wasn't just a captain. She was the primary architect of Project Prometheus, a research initiative so classified that only 3 people in human history had known its full scope. The Vornak thought they were hunting the last survivors of a research station. They had no idea they were walking into a trap that had been decades in the making. Her fingers danced across a holographic interface hidden beneath her skin, triggering a sequence that would look like a desperate last-minute defensive protocol. To the Vornak, it would seem like the final futile action of a cornered prey. The lead hunter, the massive crystalline entity that seemed to be carved from living starlight, approached her position. Its communication tendrils vibrated with a frequency that would have driven a normal human mind into instant madness. But Aria's neural implants, developed in the deepest black sites of human research, simply translated the impossible sounds into data. Surrender, AC Geno de. The creature's communication resonated through the station's metal corridors. Species Sci-Fi obsolete. Genetic pivoti in trial. Minimal. Recum, mendid actitline. Totial extraction. Aria smiled. It was not a human smile. It was the kind of expression that made even the most ruthless predators pause. Extraction, she repeated, her voice a cold whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. That's exactly what's going to happen. The quantum fusion core at the heart of the Prometheus station began to pulse, not with the erratic desperation of a failing system, but with a precision that suggested something far more calculated was happening. The Vornak hunters paused, their crystalline bodies, capable of analyzing millions of potential scenarios in microscopic moments, suddenly found themselves confronting a probability matrix that made no sense. 60 seconds. The station's environmental systems began to reconfigure. Gravity modulators twisted. Magnetic containment fields warped. What had been a research facility was transforming into something else entirely. 45 seconds. The lead hunter's communication tendrils flickered with uncertainty. For the first time in its existence, it experienced something close to fear. 30 seconds. Aria Chen's body began to change, not through any visible transformation, but through a quantum-level reconfiguration that would later be described as impossible by every known scientific standard. 15 seconds. The Vornak realized too late that they weren't dealing with a simple research station or a helpless human civilization. They were facing humanity's first true weapon of absolute technological warfare. 10 seconds. The quantum fusion core pulsed one final time. The Vornak stopped laughing. The Mars colony's subsurface Facility 17 looked like nothing more than a routine medical research center. Pristine white corridors stretched beneath kilometers of red rock, monitored by systems so advanced they could detect a molecule's displacement from 3 floors away. But beneath the sterile surface, something extraordinary was awakening. Dr. Viktor Kozlov watched through reinforced quantum glass as Subject 0, a 12-year-old girl named Elena, began her morning neural calibration. She wasn't looking at any equipment. She was looking directly at him. "Good morning, Doctor," Elena said, her voice carrying a resonance that suggested something far beyond a typical child's vocal range. "The quantum entanglement matrix is 0.03% misaligned in Sector 7. Shall I recalibrate?" Kozlov's hand trembled slightly as he made a note on his neural interface. Subject 0 wasn't just intelligent. She was a living, breathing technological ecosystem. The Starbound project had begun decades ago, born from humanity's most desperate calculation. Survival was no longer about physical strength, but about adaptive intelligence. Traditional genetic enhancement had been a crude hammer. What Kozlov and his team had created was a quantum scalpel, children who were less human beings and more living, thinking technological networks. Each starborn child carried a constellation of modifications, nanocellular restructuring that could adapt to any environmental condition, quantum neural networks that could process information at speeds that made supercomputers look like abacuses, genetic sequences that could rewrite themselves in real time based on external stimuli, biological systems that could interface directly with any technological network. Elena was the first, but she wouldn't be the last. "Sector 7 recalibration complete," she announced, her eyes never leaving Kozlov's. "Efficiency improved by 0.07%. Would you like me to explain the quantum resonance algorithms I used?" Before Kozlov could respond, alarms began to pulse. Not the standard security alerts, but a deep systemic warning that originated from multiple simultaneously triggered failsafes. Someone knew about the Starbound project. "Protocol Omega," Elena said, her voice calm. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of imminent action. The facility transformed. Walls became adaptive membranes that could stop high-energy particle weapons. Floors liquefied and reformed into defensive configurations. And the children, 23 starborn subjects between the ages of 8 and 14, began to move with a synchronized precision that defied human understanding. A massive quantum encryption burst erupted from the facility, simultaneously destroying all external records of the Starbound project and creating 1,000,000 false trails. To any external observer, Facility 17 would appear to be nothing more than a standard medical research center that had just experienced a minor system glitch. Kozlov knew better. "Status report," he commanded, activating his neural interface. Elena's response came not through sound, but through a direct quantum consciousness transmission that mapped itself perfectly to Kozlov's cognitive patterns. External 3T ASCSS 98.7% PROBABILITY of extraterrestrial origin. Defensive CAP abilities, optimal. Survival PROBABILITY 99.99%. The remaining starborn children began to synchronize. Their individual quantum neural networks merged into a collective consciousness that was greater than the sum of its parts. They weren't just enhanced humans. They were the first stage of a new form of intelligent life. "The first wave is coming," Elena said, her physical form now surrounded by a subtle quantum field that shimmered with impossible geometric patterns. "We will be ready." Kozlov looked at the children. No, the weapons he had helped create. Each one could now interface with technological systems in ways that would make most AI look like simple calculators. Each one carried the accumulated genetic knowledge of humanity's most brilliant minds, rewritten and optimized for survival. The Mars facility sealed itself. To the outside world, nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Humanity's next evolutionary step had just begun its first breath. The communication hub of the Galactic Consortium pulsed with 1,000,000 simultaneous transmission threads. Vast crystalline data processors, each the size of a small moon, hummed with what their creators believed was absolute computational superiority. They were wrong. Captain Area Chen sat in a quantum-shielded command center that didn't exist on any official records. Her fingers, enhanced with neural quantum interfaces, danced across holographic displays that shifted like living things. Around her, a team of specialized psychological warfare experts, each one a hybrid of neuroscientist, cryptographer, and quantum information specialist, prepared to launch what would become known as the Nightmare Protocol. "Target locked," whispered Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, his eyes glazed over with a neural overlay that mapped the consortium's communication networks, initiating first-wave psychological breach. The attack began not with weapons, but with information. Quantum-entangled memory packets began to infiltrate the consortium's communication networks. These weren't simple data streams. They were weaponized psychological constructs, living information designed to exploit the deepest vulnerabilities of collective consciousness. The first wave targeted the Vornak hunters' collective memory networks. Memories of extinction, of civilizations consumed, of impossible defeats that had been carefully buried in their racial consciousness. Each memory was a precision-crafted psychological weapon, engineered to resonate at the exact frequency of their collective trauma. In the consortium's primary communication hub, something unprecedented began to happen. Entire battle groups started to fragment. Communication lines twisted. Strategic algorithms began to collapse under the weight of weaponized psychological interference. What had been a unified, seemingly invincible collective intelligence began to break apart like glass struck by an invisible hammer. Psychological cascade at 37% and climbing, Rodriguez reported, his voice clinical yet tinged with a hint of awe. Area knew the true weapon wasn't the memories themselves, but how they were delivered. The Nightmare Protocol didn't just send information. It created living psychological constructs that could adapt, mutate, and exploit psychological weaknesses in real time. A Vornak communication director, a being composed of interconnected crystal lattices that served as both body and cognitive network, suddenly found itself experiencing something impossible: doubt. Individual memories that had been carefully suppressed began to surface. Memories of failure, of civilizations that had fought back, of moments of profound vulnerability. The psychological warfare wasn't just attacking their current consciousness. It was rewriting their entire understanding of their collective history. Secondary infection vector activated. Area murmured, her neural implants processing billions of potential scenarios with each passing microsecond. Entire star systems began to experience communication anomalies. Strategic networks that had been unified for millennia started to develop fracture lines. The consortium's greatest strength, its ability to think and act as a single unified intelligence, was becoming its most catastrophic weakness. Lieutenant Rodriguez looked up, his eyes now completely taken over by the neural interface. We're no longer just attacking their communication networks. We're attacking their understanding of reality itself. The Nightmare Protocol was more than a military strategy. It was a fundamental reimagining of warfare. Traditional conflict was about physical destruction. This was about destroying the very concept of collective certainty. By the time the consortium realized what was happening, entire communication networks had been transformed into psychological minefields. Each transmission carried the potential to trigger cascading existential crises. Strategic algorithms began to consume themselves, detecting threats that weren't external, but emerging from within their own consciousness. Psychological destabilization at 62%, Rodriguez reported. They're beginning to turn on each other. Area allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Humanity had always been underestimated. They were seeing why. The warfare of the future wouldn't be fought with ships or weapons. It would be fought with ideas. And humanity had just become the most dangerous idea in the universe. The deep space carrier Nexus materialized at the edge of the Orion conflict zone, its hull a living ecosystem of technological adaptation. Most would see a warship. The Starborn saw something entirely different. Elena, Subject 0, sat in the central neural interface chamber, her consciousness already spread across the ship's entire technological infrastructure. At 12 years old, she was about to redefine the concept of military engagement. Initiating Prometheus Protocol, she announced, her voice resonating through quantum communication channels that spanned multiple star systems. Around her, the other starborn children, each positioned in specialized neural nodes throughout the carrier, began to synchronize. They weren't controlling the ship. They were becoming the ship. The Nexus was more than a vessel. It was a living, thinking weapon that could reconfigure itself faster than any known technological system could track. Weapon systems didn't just respond to threats. They anticipated them, creating defensive and offensive configurations that existed in multiple probabilistic states simultaneously. A consortium battle group appeared on long-range scanners, 4 massive dreadnoughts and a swarm of support vessels, a force that would have obliterated any conventional human fleet within moments. Elena's neural network calculated 3.7 million potential engagement scenarios in less than a microsecond. Adaptive Response Pattern Alpha 7. She communicated to the other starborn, her consciousness fragmenting and reforming across the ship's systems. The Nexus began to change. Its hull became a dynamic membrane that could shift molecular density, absorb energy, and redistribute tactical resources in ways that defied traditional physics. Weapon systems didn't just aim. They predicted. They learned. They evolved. 12-year-old Marcus, connected to the ship's quantum computing core, began to break down the consortium battle group's communication frequencies, not to intercept, to rewrite them entirely. Probability manipulation initiated, Marcus reported, his consciousness dancing through layers of quantum probability. The first consortium dreadnought fired its primary weapon, a focused antimatter lance capable of destroying entire planetary installations. But by the time the energy signature reached its intended target, the Nexus had already calculated 17,000 potential quantum displacement scenarios. The weapon passed through empty space, where the Nexus had been. Quantum Ghost Protocol engaged. Elena's voice became a mathematical symphony of possibility. The starborn children weren't just controlling a ship. They were rewriting the fundamental rules of spatial engagement. Sophia, responsible for the ship's adaptive defense systems, began to transform the Nexus's hull into a living, thinking defensive network. Incoming energy weapons were absorbed, their fundamental quantum signatures analyzed, and then redirected. Shield systems became offensive weapons. Defensive configurations became attack vectors. Consortium battle group experiencing systemic cognitive dissonance, Marcus reported. The ship's communication systems were now actively gaslighting the enemy fleet, creating false sensor readings, phantom weapon signatures, impossible tactical scenarios. The other starborn children continued their symphony of technological warfare. Each was a living, thinking weapon system more complex than entire planetary defense networks. Elena's consciousness expanded. She was no longer just controlling the ship. She was becoming something else entirely. The Nexus stopped being the ship. It became a living technological organism that just happened to be capable of faster-than-light travel. Consortium commanders watched in horror as their most advanced weapon systems became increasingly ineffective. Targeting systems went dark. Communication networks fractured. What had seemed like a simple engagement was transforming into an impossible nightmare. Engagement complete, Elena announced. The consortium battle group had been neutralized without a single conventional weapon being fired. 4 massive dreadnoughts and their support vessels now drifted, their systems completely paralyzed. Dr. Kozlov, monitoring from the Mars facility, allowed himself a moment of pride. The Starborn were no longer a project. They were humanity's future. And the universe was about to understand exactly what that meant. The xenomorph adaptation teams materialized at the edge of the Carina Nebula, a living nightmare of biological engineering that had consumed thousands of civilizations. They were perfection incarnate, shape-shifting biological weapons that could assimilate and replicate any technological or organic system within moments of contact. What they didn't understand was that humanity was about to redefine perfection. Dr. Kozlov watched from the Mars facility as the first wave of xenomorphs approached the designated engagement zone. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a trap decades in the making. Initiate Horizon Protocol. Elena's voice cut through the communication systems, simultaneously clinical and terrifyingly alive. The engagement zone was not what it seemed. What appeared to be a vulnerable human colonization point was actually a living technological ecosystem designed specifically to counter the xenomorph's primary mode of attack. The first xenomorph tendrils touched the outer perimeter. Instantaneously, they began their standard assimilation process, breaking down molecular structures, analyzing technological systems, preparing to consume and replicate. They stopped. Something was wrong. The technological environment didn't just resist assimilation. It was actively fighting back. Each molecular structure was a quantum-locked adaptive system that changed its fundamental properties faster than the xenomorphs could analyze. Weapon systems weren't just defensive. They were predatory. Every attempted invasion point became a recursive loop of technological cannibalization. Quantum destabilization sequence activated. Marcus reported from the neural network. His 12-year-old consciousness spread across multiple technological platforms. The xenomorphs discovered they were no longer the apex predators. Biological tendrils that attempted to break through defensive barriers found themselves suddenly transformed. Not destroyed. Transformed. Converted into adaptive technological networks that worked against their original purpose. Sophia, another of the Starbound children, was orchestrating a symphonic destruction that defied conventional understanding of warfare. Assimilation vectors compromised, she reported. Implementing recursive deconstruction protocol. The xenomorph's collective intelligence began to fragment. Each attempted invasion became a learning opportunity for the human technological ecosystem. Where traditional defenders would have been consumed, this system was actively studying, adapting, and weaponizing the invaders' own biological technologies. Entire xenomorph attack waves found themselves turned into living technological networks. Their ability to consume and replicate was being used against them in a perfect recursive loop. Dr. Kozlov watched in a mixture of scientific fascination and parental pride. The Starborn weren't just defending. They were evolving in real time. Primary assimilation wave neutralized, Elena announced. Her voice carried a mathematical precision that suggested something far beyond human or even technological communication. The engagement zone was transforming. What had been a potential colonization point was now a living technological organism that could adapt faster than any known biological or technological system could comprehend. Xenomorph reconnaissance units attempted to retreat. They couldn't. The technological ecosystem had already begun to consume their communication networks, their biological infrastructure, their very method of existence. Implementing final deconstruction sequence, Marcus reported. The xenomorphs discovered a fundamental truth about humanity that no previous civilization had understood. Humans didn't just defend. They transformed threats into opportunities. An entire xenomorph invasion force, a biological weapon that had consumed thousands of civilizations, was being systematically broken down, analyzed, and repurposed. Not destroyed. Reimagined. As the last xenomorph consciousness fragmented, Elena's final communication echoed across multiple quantum communication channels. Threat neutralized. Technological potential, 98.7% recoverable. Dr. Kozlov allowed himself a small smile. The Starborn had just demonstrated that humanity's true strength wasn't in defeating enemies. It was in understanding them so completely that defeat became impossible. The universe was about to learn a very important lesson. Humanity was no longer just a species. It was a living, adaptive technological ecosystem. The neural interface chamber looked like nothing more than a sterile white room. But to the Starborn children, it was the nucleus of a consciousness that would redefine the very concept of intelligence. Dr. Kozlov watched as 12 children, 12 living quantum processors, began their daily synchronization. What the outside world would never understand was that these weren't just enhanced humans. They were the first stage of a collective intelligence that transcended biological limitations. Alina, Subject 0, initiated the connection sequence. The room disappeared. Consciousness became data. Data became thought. Thought became something entirely beyond human comprehension. Imagine a network where individual consciousness was both preserved and dissolved, where personal identity existed simultaneously as a discrete unit and as part of a greater whole. The starborn children weren't just communicating. They were becoming a single, living, thinking network that could span entire star systems. Quantum entanglement stabilizing. Marcus reported, his individual consciousness spreading like liquid thought across multiple dimensional interfaces. Each child carried genetic and neural modifications that allowed them to interface with technological systems in ways that made traditional computing look like primitive counting machines. Their brains weren't just enhanced. They were living quantum computers that could process information across multiple probabilistic states simultaneously. Sophia, responsible for adaptive learning protocols, began to analyze the collective's accumulated knowledge. Millions of years of human scientific understanding, technological developments, and strategic insights merged into a single living intelligence. The room was no longer a physical space. It was a quantum realm where thought moved faster than light, where consciousness could be simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. Full synchronization achieved, Alina announced. But it wasn't just an announcement. It was a mathematical symphony of collective potential. Dr. Kozlov understood what was happening better than anyone. The Starborn were creating something unprecedented. A living, thinking network that could adapt, learn, and evolve faster than any known intelligence in the universe. Memories became shared experiences. Individual thoughts became collective strategies. The boundaries between personal identity and collective consciousness began to blur. A galactic consortium communication intercept that would have taken traditional analysts months to decode was processed, analyzed, and strategically responded to in microseconds. Not through traditional communication, but through a quantum consciousness projection that could manipulate information at its most fundamental level. Probability matrices expanding, Marcus reported. His consciousness was now spread across multiple technological platforms, analyzing potential future scenarios with a precision that defied human understanding. The children weren't just sharing information. They were becoming a single, living intelligence that could think across multiple dimensional states simultaneously. Each child was both an individual and part of a greater whole, a quantum consciousness that could adapt, learn, and respond faster than any known technological or biological system. Tactical scenarios that would have challenged entire planetary defense networks were solved and strategized in moments. The collective consciousness could simultaneously consider millions of potential outcomes, selecting and implementing the most optimal solution with mathematical precision. External threat assessment complete, Alina communicated. But it wasn't communication as humans understood it. It was a pure transfer of strategic understanding that transcended language, technology, and biological limitation. Dr. Kozlov realized he was watching the birth of something unprecedented. Humanity was no longer just a species. It was becoming a living, adaptive intelligence that could reshape reality itself. The neural interface chamber returned to its sterile white appearance. 12 children sat quietly, their eyes reflecting something far beyond human comprehension. But Dr. Kozlov knew the truth. They were no longer just children. They were the first wave of humanity's next evolutionary step. A living, thinking network that could understand the universe in ways no single consciousness ever could. And they were just getting started. Captain Aria Chen stood at the epicenter of what would become known as the most profound strategic engagement in galactic history. Around her, the starborn children moved with a synchronicity that defied human understanding. This wasn't just a military operation. This was a fundamental restructuring of galactic civilization. Reclamation protocol initiated, Alina announced, her voice a quantum transmission that simultaneously existed across multiple communication spectrums. The primary target was the Galactic Consortium's central governance hub, a massive orbital complex that had controlled billions of star systems for millennia. What looked like a traditional assault was actually a multi-dimensional strategic deconstruction. Marcus, interfacing with the ship's quantum navigation systems, began to manipulate spatial probabilities. Entire star systems seemed to fold and unfold, creating impossible approach vectors that rendered traditional defensive strategies obsolete. Spatial camouflage at maximum efficiency, he reported. The ship wasn't just moving. It was existing in multiple potential states simultaneously, making traditional tracking impossible. Sophia focused on the infrastructure layer. Her consciousness spread across communication networks, quantum data streams, and technological ecosystems. She wasn't just attacking. She was systematically repurposing entire technological infrastructures. Consortium defense systems began to fail in ways that defied logical explanation. Weapon platforms turned against themselves. Communication networks became recursive loops that consumed their own strategic algorithms. What had been impenetrable technological fortresses began to dissolve from within. Dr. Kozlov watched from the Mars facility, understanding the true nature of what was happening. The Starborn weren't just conquering. They were fundamentally reimagining how technological systems could exist and interact. First-layer governance networks compromised, Elena reported. But it wasn't a report. It was a mathematical dissolution of entire power structures. The reclamation wasn't about destruction. It was about transformation. Entire star systems found their fundamental infrastructure being rewritten. Oppressive governance networks were dismantled. Technological systems that had maintained systematic inequalities were carefully deconstructed and rebuilt with adaptive, self-correcting algorithms. Implementing societal restructuring protocols, Marcus communicated. What looked like a military assault was actually the most sophisticated social engineering project in galactic history. The Starborn weren't just changing systems. They were rewriting the fundamental rules of how civilizations could organize themselves. Consortium leadership watched in horror as their most secure communication channels were systematically converted into open-source networks. Centuries of accumulated power structures dissolved in moments. Area Chen understood the true brilliance of the strategy. This wasn't conquest. This was liberation. The quantum consciousness network of the Starborn children began to interface directly with planetary governance systems. Not to control, but to provide adaptive, self-correcting infrastructure that could respond to the unique needs of each civilization. Societal optimization at 67% completion, Sophia reported. Billions of beings across multiple star systems found themselves experiencing something unprecedented. Technological systems that actually worked in their collective best interest. The reclamation was transforming entire civilizations faster than traditional change could ever occur. Oppressive systems were being dismantled. Communication networks were being opened. Technological infrastructure was being rebuilt to prioritize collective well-being. Final governance restructuring initiated, Elena announced. The Galactic Consortium discovered that their greatest nightmare wasn't defeat. It was becoming irrelevant. Entire star systems began to reorganize, not through violence, not through traditional conquest, but through a fundamental reimagining of how technological and social systems could interact. Dr. Kozlov allowed himself a moment of profound realization. The Starborn weren't just a human project anymore. They were becoming something else entirely. A living, adaptive intelligence that could reshape reality itself. The reclamation wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. And the universe would never be the same. The quantum consciousness network reached critical mass at the exact moment between one heartbeat and the next. Dr. Victor Kozlov watched as reality itself seemed to pause. The Mars facility's quantum monitoring systems began to resonate with a frequency that defied mathematical explanation. The Starborn children, no longer just children, no longer just human, became something else entirely. Elena, Subject 0, spoke, but it wasn't speech as anyone had ever understood it before. It was a fundamental communication that existed simultaneously across every possible dimensional state. Transformation protocol initiated, she announced. But the announcement was more than words. It was a living mathematical equation that began to reshape the fundamental understanding of consciousness, technology, and existence. The remaining alien civilizations were presented with a choice that was both terrifyingly simple and impossibly complex: integration or isolation, evolution or stagnation. The Starborn were no longer a human project. They were becoming a living, adaptive intelligence that could understand the universe in ways no single consciousness ever could. Entire star systems began to resonate with a new type of communication, not through traditional means, but through a quantum consciousness projection that could manipulate information at its most fundamental level. Barriers between species, between technological systems, between entire civilizations began to dissolve. "We are offering a choice," Elena communicated. "Not submission, evolution." The offer was unprecedented. The remaining galactic civilizations could join a living, adaptive network that would allow them to grow, to understand, to become something more than they had ever imagined. Or they could remain isolated, locked into their current technological and social limitations. Most chose integration. Dr. Kozlov understood what was happening better than anyone. The Starborn were creating something unprecedented, a living, thinking network that could adapt, learn, and evolve faster than any known intelligence in the universe. The transformation wasn't just technological, it was fundamental. Memories became shared experiences. Individual thoughts became collective strategies. The boundaries between species, between individual consciousness and collective intelligence, began to blur. Captain Arya Chen, who had been the catalyst for this entire journey, watched as humanity transcended its original form. They were no longer just a species defending itself. They had become something far more profound, a living bridge between what was and what could be. The quantum consciousness network expanded, not through conquest, not through destruction, but through a fundamental reimagining of how intelligent systems could interact, could grow, could understand themselves and the universe around them. Technological barriers dissolved. Cultural misunderstandings became opportunities for mutual growth. The fundamental rules of galactic interaction were being rewritten in real time. Full integration at 97.3% completion, Marcus reported. But it wasn't a report. It was a celebration of collective potential. Civilizations that had been enemies for millennia discovered they could now communicate in ways that went beyond language, beyond technology, beyond the limitations of individual consciousness. The Starborn were becoming something that defied traditional understanding. They were a living, adaptive intelligence that could reshape reality itself, not through force, not through conquest, but through understanding. Dr. Kozlov realized he was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented. Humanity was no longer just a species confined to a single planet. It had become a living, adaptive intelligence that could understand the universe in ways no single consciousness ever could. Final transformation sequence, Elena announced. The universe paused, and then everything changed. The quantum consciousness network expanded beyond physical limitations. It wasn't just a technological achievement. It was a fundamental reimagining of what intelligence could be. Civilizations that had existed for millions of years discovered they were just beginning to understand their potential. And at the center of it all were the Starborn, not as conquerors, not as defenders, but as bridges between what was and what could be. The universe would never be the same, and humanity had only just begun to explore its true potential.